The format of this morning is that I'm going to begin with a kind of exegesis on the passage, and then I'm going to be asking Bill for his input. The focus of this morning's attention, as you know, is Jesus' healing of the blind man. And as with most of you, I've heard that story for as long as I can remember it. And I've heard it used for sermons, challenging each of us not to let Jesus pass us by in our own state of blindness, whatever state that might be. But this morning, we have the privilege of revisiting that text from the perspective of someone who is now literally blind. And he has given me carte blanche, the privilege of asking him anything. Right, Bill?
Correct.
Yeah, correct. Oh, Bill, you know not what you read.
I have to go home now.
Before I ask any questions, I'm going to first put the passage in context. Lots of people might be able to tell you that the very first recorded miracle of Jesus was at the wedding in Cana when Jesus provided good wine. But I think there are very few who could tell you that his last recorded miracle was the healing of the blind man. Now, why is that significant? It is significant because in that day, the consensus was that one's maladies were directly related to God's judgment of you. If you were good, you lived a long and carefree life, and if not, you would suffer. Blindness was deemed to be one of the greatest hardships that could befall one, so therefore it was assumed that if one was blind, he or she had done something pretty bad to deserve God's wrath. And so, for Jesus to swoop in and to give someone sight could easily have been understood as an act of insurrection, of erasing God's punishment. Imagine if you were a parent and had given your child a time out. Then someone who happens to be one of your dinner guests comes along and says to your child, "No, you're free. You do not have to sit here any longer." How would you feel watching that? It was a bold move on Jesus' part. And not only was that bold, but Luke tells us that the very next thing that Jesus does is to invite himself to dinner at the home of a despised tax collector. Don't forget Zacchaeus. 2 strikes. Not a good idea if you're trying to win votes so as to stay alive. Those were 2 very bold moves on Jesus' part. So now it's no wonder that Calgary was right around the corner. Looking at the text itself, don't miss the irony. A blind man asks, "What's happening?" And he's told that Jesus of Nazareth was passing by. That's how people were identified back then, not by last names, by surnames as we use them. But, for example, Dan, you're not here, so I'll pick on you. Dan, instead of being Dan Erickson, would be known as Dan of Santa Monica. But notice that the blind man can see what many of the sighted people cannot. And the blind man on the spot is able to identify Jesus' true significance. So when the blind man is told it's Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus the Nazarene, the blind man responds by saying, "That's the Son of David." The Son of David was a messianic title, revealing that this man knows that Jesus is God's anointed one. He knows that. And then at the end of the passage comes that most intriguing and challenging question, because it's so obvious, it's a hello or da. When Jesus turns to the man, he asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" Seems obvious. So, Bill, here I come. I'm going to start with two questions. And the first one is going to be, it's actually two-part. First, why do you think that Jesus asked the blind man the question, what do you want me to do for you? And then secondly, I'd like to ask you, if Jesus were to ask you that very same question, what would you answer? So two parts. The first part is, why do you think Jesus asked that question? Since the answer seems so obvious.
In thinking about it, I have an answer that I'm not entirely pleased with. What I think happened in that questioning is that when he said, "What is it you want me to do for you?" opened the door to the reality of his question being genuine. It was obvious, but he needed to say, "I want to see." We can say, like the question was from Penny, that what others aspects of life come to be different or better one way or the other from being unable to see. Things do gain a different perspective. Other senses come into play. What Jesus was asking, and I think the man intuited this, was a spiritual question as much as it was a physical question. What is it you want me to do for you was a trust level into the unseen. A long time ago, I had a conversation with a gentleman who said, after we were discussing religion, about our Christianity, and can you prove it, and all those questions were back and forth. And his response was, it's all faith. All faith. I went to Paul, St. Paul, and looked up faith. And one of Paul's quotes, statements, is something that I treasure. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And this was played out in this little drama with the blind man. He had faith, and had faith that somebody would come along or something would happen that would take seriously his quest. I could keep on going, but
all right. I will ask you the second part then. Given that, and I think that's such a rich interpretation, that Jesus is asking for more of a response than just related to the physical, but spiritual also. So given that it's understood the needs are both, how would you answer that question if Jesus were to say, Bill Gardai, what do you want me to do for you, both physically and spiritually? What would you say?
I want to see. I would say that spiritual seeing is as important now for me as my complete blindness. I'm no longer completely blind. I can see to some degree. And there has been hope all along that this might decidedly improve or get better. It was recently pronounced to me that it probably would not get any better. And I'm not as afraid of that as I used to be, because I don't know what else you're going to ask, but this will trail into some of the things I wanted to thought about saying.
Go ahead.
For the first number of years in my ministry, I did not feel legitimate. I felt I didn't have a majestic call. People talk about having a call. And I'm reminded of a story of the old farmer who came out of church after listening to the preacher, and he asked him how he knew he should preach. And he said, well, I saw the sign in the sky, GPC, and I knew immediately it meant go praise Christ, go preach for Christ. And the old farmer said, how do you know it didn't mean go plow corn? But I was looking for the sign in the sky for a long time, and it never came. And that was, I want to refer to that period of time as I was spiritually blind. And then a turn came in my life when I began to hear understand the call in a different way. And that one's mind can be at work, and you can be in church with a mind that is inquiring, that you can do good for people without having to perform miracles all the time. And that was the beginning of seeing. So there's a division in my understanding of spiritual blindness and spiritual sight. And so I would call physical blindness sight and spiritual blindness insight. It gives you a new understanding. And that's what I was trusting, and I think was enabled and am enabled, because that's what the definition of faith is. Faith is a substance. So that's a form of sustenance. Feeds you. Faith is a substance of things hoped for. And my response to the blindness, it was not my response, it was my hearing in the meditative times that have come to me, that Jesus spoke to me many ways, and I was legitimate. That's one aspect of now I don't know where I am in the lineup of things.
Was there anything else that happened as a result of your vision problems that affirmed you, that said, yes, that call was legitimate, it was meant for you long, long ago?
Well, it was answered the way I believe Christ does answer us, by the gift of people into
Yes.
my life.
And can you tell us how people affirmed you at that point in time?
I began to hear what people said. I wasn't always listening. Shh.
And what were they saying?
Well, Bill Lord recorded 10 sermons, imagine that, of mine. And I never really listened to me. And I began to listen through these sermons, and I liked it. And when people would comment on it, what it meant to them began to be more real to me. I could hear in a different way what people were saying. They weren't just blowing up a bunch of baloney at me and filling me with the same thing with their comments. They were meaning it, and I needed to hear that. It's sort of like, what is it that I can do for you that Jesus asked? Was knock off I wanted Jesus to help me understand what they were saying, or at least accept it and move on. And that has happened and continues to happen. And something very special has happened for me in this particular church. at the end of my journey, that I should find such a spiritual home is absolutely all that I could ever have hoped for. So he answered, what is it I can do for you? He has granted me both a lack of fear and an insight into what really counts. So my journey isn't alone my sight. I also have, as you all know, or most of you, Parkinson's disease as well. And the combination is not a happy one. But one doesn't need to dwell in the darkness when there is so much light to be risen with. So, I don't know if that answers.
It does. It does. I want to ask you again what Penny asked you. Her first question to you was, is it scary? And as she mentioned, and as I've noticed, at first, as it would all of us, it seemed to bring a great deal of fear, the evolution of where your sight was going. And then you've just mentioned that the fear is gone. How does that work? How did that transition happen? Is that defies understanding to me. How is it that you lost your fear?
I began to live by faith as a substance of things hoped for. My hope grew, and the evidence in that hopefulness became more and more real. And that's the gift. That's not something I could do automatically. It was a given to me, and I began to hear it and believe it. And it's been affirmed for me through the gift of friendship. I don't know how this works, but one day I turned around and all my friends were 65 and up.
Bill, I'm 63. I'm 63.
All right. Don't go away. You're not too young. Where was I?
You said your friends were 65 and up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's strange. And I've heard of this for a long time. Birds of a feather flock together. Well, that's a theology that I wish you would learn and be proud of. My friends are my gifts. And that has helped to make my life as good as it has ever been.
Thank you. Thank you. In closing, I just want to say that I think it's so interesting in the passage that Jesus says to the blind man, not my faith has healed you, but he says to the blind man, your faith, your own faith has saved you. And from what you have just shared with us this morning, it is such a vivid, yes.
Bill was pastor of the Guilford Laconia United Methodist Church sometime after I was there, and I want to testify that the congregation still remembers him well, loves him, and it must have been after he got rid of that scaredness, because he served well there in that church in New Hampshire.
Thank you. Thank you. Another friend.
I hate him.